And we're going to talk about a couple of things. The first is really history, not of the movement, but of our understanding of sexual assault. Context is very important, as the stories that you were telling are absolutely true. You know, the context in which something happens. And sexual violence did not appear in 1970. It appeared 4,000 years ago. This is a lesson in the more things change, the more they stay the same, unfortunately. So let's go back to 4,000 years ago. The first known written rape law was contained in the ancient Babylonian Code of Hammurabi. And that was in 2250 BC. The 282 rules on the Code of Hammurabi were all written in if-then form. If a man steals an ox, then he must pay back 30 times the ox's cost. The edicts range from family law to professional contracts and administrative law, often outlining different standards of justice for the three classes of Babylonian society. And they, of course, they were the property class, freedmen, and slaves. Women had social status only in relation to men. A woman might be a virgin living with her father or a married woman living with her husband. In this code, rape of a virgin was punished by death, and the virgin was held blameless. Rape of a married woman was considered adultery, and the woman was held equally responsible. Deaths and sentenced to death. Death of the rapist and the victim were by drowning. The victim's husband had the option of rescuing his wife by pulling her out of the river. The ancient Assyrians followed the principle of eye for an eye very strictly. Now, think of women's rights in this. Thus, the father of a raped virgin could rape the rapist's wife as punishment. The Hebrews punished rape by stoning. If a virgin was raped within the city walls where she could have cried for help, she was stoned along with the rapist. If she was outside the city, she had to marry her rapist, and he was forced to pay the bride price to her father. On the other hand, if a virgin was already betrothed, the rapist was stoned and the girl was sold into marriage for a low price. Any married woman who was raped was stoned with her rapist for adultery. Do you hear echoes of even today? Even though it sounds so awful, you can hear some of the same things today. Early pre-British law in England follows a similar pattern. The earliest known law is Celtic law, and it's an interesting exception to the lack of regard for female victims of rape. Not only was rape recognized as a crime against a woman instead of against her father or husband, it was punishable by fines. But what kinds of rape were actually defined? They were forcible rape against a woman's will, and rape where the woman was incapable of consent due to intoxication or mental illness. Many of the 50 states don't even have that law in the books. And rape where the woman was incapable of consent, did that. There was a certain exception. The woman had to cry for help, if possible, and had to report the rape immediately. Also, promiscuous and adulterous women were not protected. So you had to prove you were neither of those. During the Anglo-Saxon period, there were some changes to the law. In the 10th century, different levels of sexual assault were established with different punishments. The most severe punishment for forced intercourse was death plus castration, and castration to the rapist's male animals as well, his horse, his dog, his oxen. The rapist's possessions were then given to the victim. Realistically, though, this level of punishment was rare and applied in cases of high-born victims protected by powerful men. In the 11th and 12th centuries, canon law began to view rape as less than a property crime and more of a violent sexual crime against an individual. 4 elements of rape were identified: violence, abduction, intercourse, and lack of consent. The victim was required to cry out, but not to have evidence of strong resistance. There was a marital rape exemption. We'll talk about that later. There is no rape if the man was married to the woman. And prostitutes were excluded. Rapists could not marry their victims to prevent them from benefiting from their crime. Although rape was treated as a serious crime that was technically against the woman, it was still treated practically as a crime against the father or the husband. Starting in the 12th century, female rape victims were allowed to bring a civil suit, which could result in a trial by jury. However, bringing this suit was onerous. I was dealing with a civil suit today. It can be still onerous, including showing everyone the physical results of the rape immediately after. In addition, if the rapist denied the rape, 4 women had to examine the victim to see if she were no longer a virgin. Some of the defenses the rapist could use were that the woman had slept with him before or that she consented. We've heard it. The statutes of Westminster at the end of the 13th century significantly changed the law of rape. They provided that the crime of rape applied to all women, virgin or married, including concubines and prostitutes. Further, if the suit against the rapist was not pressed by the victim's family, the Crown could prosecute. You'll hear a lot more about law later, but rape is not a crime against the victim. It is a crime against the state under criminal law. It defined it as a crime against the state and not just against the family as a property crime. However, rape victims were viewed with suspicion. Their reputations were examined. They had to have a third-party support for their claim, which means it's a really good idea to have a witness to a rape. And they had to report the rape right away, and they had to have cried for help. Think of how this has filtered down into our lives today. At the end of the 16th century, rape became carnal knowledge of a woman 10 years or older, forcibly and against her will. This is known as the common law definition of rape and was picked up by the American colonies. Early statutes in Massachusetts reflected the common law definition of rape, which also provided a marital rape exemption, but it did not require corroboration of the victim's testimony. Later laws did. Many of you have heard the Matthew Hale, and it was still being used in courts 30 and 40 years ago. He was the Lord Chief Justice of the King's Bench, and he said, and again they used it in jury instructions, rape is an accusation easy to be made, harder to be proved, and harder to be defended by the party accused, though ever so innocent. So if you can imagine the guy in the wig standing up at the bench saying, it's an easy crime to charge and a difficult crime to disprove, even though he's innocent. What do you think if you're a juror? Early American rape statutes incorporated the common law definition of rape and were known as carnal knowledge statutes. They defined forcible rape as intercourse by force and against the woman's will. This focused on the response of the victim and led to the interpretation that sex was only rape if a woman resisted to the utmost and resisted in a manner during the entire rape. So fighting, whatever, screaming the whole time. In colonial New England, rape was a capital offense. Mandatory death penalty was also prescribed for sexual intercourse with a child under 10. Courts were reluctant to enforce the death penalty, and rapists were rarely executed. Laws varied greatly from colony to colony. Settlement of damages in the form of monetary payments remained common. They were made to the husband or the father of the victim instead of the victim herself. By the late 1700s, one by one, women recognized the powerlessness in the face of male domination in education, in social, political, and economic institutions of the emerging United States. In 1790, Mary Wollstonecraft, and now I apologize, how many women's studies people do I have in here? Oh,
A minor in it.
okay, that's good enough. Apologies. I am about to take 100 years of feminism and do it in 2 paragraphs. I mean, this is stuff that entire classes are taught on. So,
Could I have my tuition money back?
yes, you'll learn everything you need to know in these 2 paragraphs. She wrote, "The Vindication of the Rights of Women. She recognized the failure of education for girls and the powerlessness of women. She ridiculed the notion that of women as meek and modest, as attractive playthings. She maintained that women should be equal partners to their husbands. Her words served as a galvanizing force. That force began with the anti-slavery movement. Angelina and Sarah Grimke were among the first early activists during the anti-slavery movement during the 1800s. They were born into a slaveholder family, but rejected the family and joined the abolitionist Quakers. They published letters and went on speaking tours against slavery and championing the rights of women. This is 1830. Can you imagine how popular they were? The Women's Rights Convention of 1848 solidified because men attempted to silence the women at an early anti-slavery convention. This was the first major national organizing around women's rights. You've heard the names: Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, Lucretia Mott. They were all there, and they are considered the mothers of the early feminist movement. 200 women attended the convention. They passed the Declaration of Sentiments, which was written like the Declaration of Independence, calling on women to organize and petition for their rights. They had lots of discussion on whether or not women should even try to get the right to vote, and all of the reasons they shouldn't. The right to vote passed by a narrow margin, and in reflection of the pervasive racism of the time, women of color were not included in the right to vote. They were at the convention, but they were not included. Sojourner Truth connected the issues of women and race in her Ain't I a Woman speech, you've all heard it, I hope, at a women's convention in 1851. In the South, white women became an important symbol of the supremacy of Southern white aristocracy, both before and after slavery. High standards were developed for her conduct and behavior. These standards did not apply to the white men who openly and systematically raped black women. The abuses continued long after slavery ended. Ku Klux Klansmen and other lynch mobs used the rape of black women as a tactic of spreading terror in the newly freed communities and as retribution against freed people attempting to assert their rights. In 1866, the Memphis riots occurred. Congress held hearings about the chaos and brutality during the riot. People were killed all over the city, many of whom were just in their own homes. Black women testified before Congress about being raped by a white mob. These were perhaps the first women to break the silence about rape. And their testimony, they were young. They were like 14, 15. Guys broke into their home, told them to fix dinner. They fixed dinner. Then the guys threw out the food, which you didn't do in those times. And then they raped the women. And they had the courage to come forward and speak in front of Congress. Now, if you've been watching any of the hearings of the last day or so, you can imagine what it would be like. And they did it. And we've got transcripts of what they said. In 1872, Susan B. Anthony and 14 other women tried to register to vote. She was arrested and refused to pay the $100 fine. In 1920, that right was won. The second wave of women's activism began with the Civil Rights Movement and the students' free speech movement in the 1960s. Other social change movements at the time included labor and anti-war. That was the Vietnam anti-war. I used to say I grew up in the war era, but now there have been so many that I can't anymore. In the 50s and 60s, the economic needs of families had prompted women who had been employed in the war years to return to work. They knew from history that eventually men would concede some things, the right to vote, the right to work. But women had never before demanded a movement that would cause gender roles to change. The anti-rape movement did not spring out of thin air. It came from 4,000 years ago, it came from hundreds of years ago, and then we come to my era, which is not quite hundreds of years ago. The first rape speak out happened in New York City on January 24th, 1971. Rape conferences also began, one sponsored by the New York Radical Feminists in April of '71. The first rape crisis center was started by the Bay Area Women Against Rape in 1971. I would ask, where were you in 1971, but so many weren't born. But if we could think about, so Sandra Butler, who many of you have read some of her work, said in a speech to the National Coalition Against Sexual Assault in 1996, she was reminiscing, and she said, "We saw what was needed and we made it up. It was that simple. Nobody knew how to create a rape crisis center, develop crisis intervention for abused adolescents, create ongoing support groups for adult women, engage the criminal justice system as allies in the effort to engage women in seeking justice in traditional institutions. No one had yet learned how to create protocol for examining a sexually abused child. No one. We were it. We just kept putting one foot in front of the other, making it up as we went along." And that is exactly what we did. You made it up because you didn't know what else. And you knew that if you listened, if you responded, if you offered every option possible, that you couldn't quite be doing it too wrong, you hoped. I was at the University of Minnesota in 1971, and I was at Kaufman Union, and I was the president of Kaufman Union, and next door to my office was the Women's Liberation Office. I love these titles. It was the Women's Liberation Office. And I was a journalism major. I was going to be a Barbara Walters. Nobody grows up and says, "Oh, I want to run a rape crisis center." Just doesn't happen. I was going to be a journalist, and they came over to my office and said, "We hear you can write." Okay, she said, would you help? We're going to start a rape crisis center in Minneapolis. There was nothing in the state. We're going to start a rape crisis center. Would you help us? So heck yes. So, we did pamphlets and that sort of thing, and wrote grants and all that. And in 1971, they got a storefront in uptown Minneapolis, and they started providing services. They got a phone line, and a whole bunch of feminist women, they got a phone line, and people started to call. That's literally how easily and with what difficulty it started. And they certainly took their cues from what had happened in New York and what was happening in California. It happened on the coasts first, of course. Everything happens there. And they spent a lot of time with Boston, because Boston had one of the first rape crisis centers. But they had no money. And it couldn't keep going forever. And this was before anybody was funding. You didn't say the word rape out loud. Nobody was funding rape services. And so an organization called the Neighborhood Involvement Program, many of you are aware of NIP, went to them and said, we have multiple services. We're located on Hennepin Avenue also. We have multiple services. We would, why don't we take it over? And and NIP had begun in 1968, so it had been going a few years, and it had gotten some funding and had some government funding. So in 1972, NIP took over the Rape Crisis Center and dismissed all the founders for being too feminist. And so they were gone, and it became a little more social service-y, and don't ask me what too feminist is. Marty Burt, who was one of the people, has said, well, you had to dress right, you had to talk right, you had to do this. So I got to tell you, who would been kicked out? Most of us. But it still was the first rape crisis center in the state, and another one came a couple years later in St. Paul, and that's called SOS, Sexual Offense Services, and that's been going for a long, long time also. I was one of the founding moms of PAVSA in Duluth. That's where I was. I was going to school, and then I was teaching at UMD. And UMD was fairly progressive. And one day, one of the professors, who was a good friend of mine, said, I'm going to teach a class on rape. He was a sociology professor. He said, I'm going to teach a course on rape. And rather than be supportive and kind, I said something brilliant like, oh shit, no man should ever teach a course on rape. Who the hell do you think you are? And what showed was his good heart, because about 3 weeks later, he called me into his office and said, you're teaching it with me. And so for the next 4 years, we taught the sociology of rape. It was the first course on rape taught in the country. And it was a great deal of fun. We would limit ourselves to 15 students. Some were law enforcement, some were social workers, some were just regular old students. It was an upper division course, so you had to have some experience. And out of that came a task force that said we ought to do something about rape in Duluth, and that in 1970. We started in 1974. PAVSA actually got funded in 1975. And it's still going strong, which is wonderful, you know. But if you think about the times, so 1975, when we first started teaching on rape, there was one book coming out, and that was Susan Brownmiller's Men, Women, and Rape. Now you walk into any bookstore, especially a woman's bookstore, and there are shelves of sexual violence, domestic violence, all this stuff. My son-in-law was in my home office one time, and he was sitting on the floor waiting for me, and he was doing this, and then he'd do this. And I finally said, what are you doing? He said, you have the most depressing office I've ever seen. That wall was sexual violence, this wall was misconduct by clergy, this wall was domestic violence, and this wall was chemical dependency. You know, but we learned. You know, now there's more books than you can ever read out. In 1975, the Department of Corrections began funding battered women's services and sexual assault services, due in no small part to a woman who was my mentor. Her name was Peggy Spector. And she, I don't want to say she bullied them. Let's just say she didn't stop until she got what she wanted. And that was funding for programs. And so from then on, rape crisis centers could apply to the state to get ongoing funding. Never enough, but ongoing funding. In 1975, the Criminal Sexual Conduct Code was adopted. And you know, when we said how things change, I was on the task force for that because they realized that most of the people on the task force were from the metro area. And if you're not from the metro area, you know, there is always a schism. There's a Duluth, the city schism. There's a, you know, all sorts of things. And they realized they better throw some rural people, Duluth, rural, no, in quickly. So I got to sit on the task force that created the law. And I cannot tell you the difference in prosecution of a law from before that said, did she cry out? Did she have a witness? Was there a weapon used? And if those things weren't what they expected, they would not charge. To a law, which you learn a lot more about, that is gender neutral. It never says the girls are the victims and the boys are the offenders, or women and men, etc. Men can be victims, women can be offenders. And it laid out categories of rape. And you know, you'll learn all this. But it changed dramatically how we could charge rape. In fact, I used to say we don't have rape in Minnesota anymore. Isn't that nice? We have criminal sexual conduct instead. But it's much better. So that's one of the good things. But today, so if it was passed in 1975, that's a lot of years ago. Today, the governor signed the marital rape exemption bill, finally, after 40 years or something like that, which we could not get passed in all of the years I worked in sexual violence. You know, it was like, well, a husband can't rape his wife, or if you're living together, or if whatever. It kind of had to be if there was, they might charge it if there'd been a, if they'd been legally separated or things like that. Now they're going to take it out, which is fabulous. But he did that today, of all things. It's amazing. In 1978, at I don't know if NOVA is still around, the National Organization of Victim Assistance. I think that's been taken other names now, but there was a national convention of NOVA, and what the people at NOVA, what the women at NOVA realized, who were working with victims of sexual assault and victims of battering, is that NOVA cared about break-ins and gun violence and things like that, but didn't care much about women. So at that conference, the National Coalition Against Sexual Assault and the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault were born. And NCASA has now morphed into something else, but for years it was the primary national voice for sexual assault victims. I was the president for a couple years way back when, and back when the Violence Against Women Act was first propounded, and it took Joe Biden years and years and years. So if you were looking at any of the hearings and looking at the Judiciary Committee, that's where I was sitting, but I was saying truth instead of some of the other things that were being said. And there were 5 of us. It wasn't just me talking about why on earth would you need a Violence Against Women Act? Aren't they taken care of in the laws? You know, what about men? Men can be victims too. Yes, yes, yes. But eventually it got passed, and it's been funding, services forever. And it has been renewed every couple of years. But I don't know how long it will be renewed. We'll see. Under NIP, the program grew. There was lots of education. We wrote the first grant for legal advocacy in the county attorney's office. However, there were some issues. We had a director who liked to pat people on the head and liked to say, girls, girls. Now, it's all right. So NIP was going to move into a big building, create a big building right on Hennepin Avenue. And the Sexual Violence Center back then it was the Rape and Sexual Assault Center. The Rape and Sexual Assault Center was under NIP. And we were in a house on 31st and Fremont. And we'd been there for years and years and years. And one day, he was showing us the plans of the building, and the Rape and Sexual Assault Center was going to be on the 3rd floor, and we'd seen the plans last month, and then the plans this month, and I said something like, where's the elevator? And he said, well, we don't need it, so we took it out. Now, this is in the heyday of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It had been passed, it was being, tested, it was wonderful, and he said, we don't need it. And I said, how can that be? Because the Rape and Sexual Assault Center is a public entity. And he said, well, what we'll do is if you need a counseling room, we'll make it on the 1st floor that's accessible. And that was the beginning of the end. And my question was, well, what about if we wanted to hire someone who was in a wheelchair? Well, that's not going to happen. Then we had a wonderful, outspoken director named Barbara Chester, and she kept questioning some of his things, like, oh, look, taking the sexual violence money and putting it into the counseling center or other programs of NIP, that sort of thing. And that's not unusual, but it was a lot of our money. And there were other things. So eventually one day, he gave Barbara a 8 or 10 page expose, put her on probation of everything she had done wrong for the last couple of years. And as we went through it line by line, many of the things that had happened way before she'd become director. But it was clear that the writing was on the wall. Then he wrote a memo that said that they were going to make the Rape and Sexual Assault Center higher class. And so they were going to institute a dress code for the Sexual Violence Center. And that was kind of the last straw. And we had hundreds and hundreds of we had 200 volunteers at that time. And it was and as you know, or as you will find out, what most of you will be doing is answering the phone without a camera pointing at you like I have. And, it doesn't matter what you wear as long as you're comfy. But we also knew that was, the beginning of the end. So we knew she was about to be fired. And so one day, there was also, the Sexual Violence Center wasn't supposed to be too feminist, kind of like what happened in the early 70s with them. And we don't know what too feminist is. Arguing for women's rights, is that too feminist? I don't know. But there was the memo that talked about being too feminist. So knowing that the end was near, and knowing that we could not continue, there were many, many other issues that had happened. One day, it was February 1st, 1985, 7 of the 8 staff members and 200 volunteers resigned. All the volunteers did not come in. They had all signed things. There had been many, many, many meetings with the board, with the Sexual Violence Center's board, which was only an advisory committee at that point, but everyone was saying we can't do our work anymore. We can't do it. So we walked in, and there were 7 of the 8 of us. The 8th was on maternity leave and said, I can't afford to lose my job. And that was fine. We were not upset with her. So there were 6 females and 1 male. And when we were shaking in our boots as we walked into his office. It was like, oh my God, what have we done? We also had to realize that we were now off salary. So we had to spend time with all of our significant others saying rent, mortgage, insurance, kids, all that stuff. And our volunteers were promising to buy groceries for us and all of those things. And all of our partners were in it, thank goodness. And we went in to resign. So we had a letter, a lovely, well-done letter, and handed it to him. And there we all standing. And he said something like, have you all got your periods? Oh. Which was pretty funny for Mark, who was one of the therapists on staff, who was standing there kind of going, okay. So we walked out, and we had an attorney and the chair, the person who would become the chair of the board, waiting at the state to incorporate us. But we didn't have a name. We couldn't be the Rape and Sexual Assault Center. And so we smoked in those days, little wonder. We smoked in those days, and so 3 of us are pacing outside, smoking. And what do you call the place? I had been doing a lot of stuff with Illusion Theater on Good Touch, Bad Touch, so I was like, bad touch place. I don't know, We came up with as many things as you can think of. Sexual violence wasn't really being used very much yet. Sexual assault was. But sexual violence wasn't. And after and the attorney kept calling saying, I need to incorporate before the office closes. And so he's waiting, and eventually, and this is before cell phones, so he had to go to a payphone to call us, So I don't know how, but I said sexual violence place, and then somebody said center, and all of a sudden it was the Sexual Violence Center, and here we are. We were the front page of the Star Tribune for a while. These rabid women gone rogue is what we were. And what happened, NIP did horrible things like say, well, they're all lesbian, and therefore you can't trust them. And then, which was only partly true. I'd say there were probably 2 of us, and the rest were straight. But once you put that in a headline, then it was that we had done this all illegally and blah blah blah. And we had attorneys every step of the way, and so then the issue of funding happened. So we were funded by the Department of Corrections. We were funded by Hennepin County. And we had already gotten promises because of Peggy Spector and her work at the state that the Department of Corrections money would just slide to us. The Hennepin County Board just was terrified of all of this rancor and all of this arguing and all of this icky stuff, and they didn't want to be the bad guy to anybody, so they funded both of us for a while, and I think they still are. I don't know, but so that's how we were created. About 3 weeks after, our terror was that essentially the data and the records belonged to the Rape and Sexual Assault Center. And we were hearing rumblings. We had a mole up at NIP, and she said they're going to come and they're going to contact all the victims. Well, we had been going since 1972, you know, and we were terrified that they were going to take those records and start calling people. And that puts women's lives at risk, as well as just the horror of it all. So we had always been very careful, and I don't know how the record keeping goes now, but we'd always been very careful that we had a book that had the number and the name and just one place, and all of the records, and you can imagine how many files we had, were of numbers, and so they couldn't get to them. They couldn't. So one day we're in our little office in our little house in South Minneapolis, and 3 men walk in with trench coats on. It's like a bad movie. And Dorothy and I, one of the other staff members, saw them come and thought, okay, they're kicking us out of our office because they held the lease. And the building was owned by the church across the street, who had been our partners in all sorts of things, and the minister loved us all dearly. He was wont to bring in victims at like 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon and say, you need to talk to her, you know, somebody from his church. So these guys literally come in with trench coats and dollies. And we had a long-term client. We had a therapist on staff, and we had a long-term client, and she was mentally handicapped. And she stood in the middle of the floor. She didn't know what was going on. She, had no idea who they were. But she started screaming, "These men are bad. I don't like these men. Make them go away." And all Dorothy and I did was turn over the line to the answering service. And because they didn't have the code, they couldn't get into it. And take the book with all, it didn't fit really, it was more of it was big, it fit under her skirt. And she's put it down her skirt and, put her shirt over it, and we walked out. Now, the minute the church heard of that, they evicted the Rape and Sexual Assault Center, but they had to give them 30 days notice. So they said, come on over. So my office was the clergyman's office. We were holding groups in the chapel. We were holding, we did kids things back then in the basement, and the phones, and we kept going until they were evicted, and then we moved back in. So since then, I can't tell you how many directors there have been, 2, 3, 4. I became the director probably a year or so after that. Barbara Chester stayed. And then she went on to work with the Center for Victims of Torture. It was like frying pan fire. And then she went on to be a therapist in Alaska. But we started with risk. We started with, what else did we start with? We started with fear. But we also always started knowing that what we were doing was the right thing. Our families believed it, our volunteers believed it, and we became kind of not friends, but working people with the Rape and Sexual Assault Center, by the way, which closed a couple of years ago. When NIP closed, and NIP closed with very little notice, all of a sudden we got a thing that said NIP has closed, and they had many more services. They had the Rape and Sexual Assault Center, they had a clinic and a dental clinic and elderly services and chores for the elderly services, and it was just gone. And then they placed their what was left of the Rape and Sexual Assault Center with Cornerstone, which is down in Bloomington. Any questions about that? It's fun. I cannot tell you how terrified we were at times, like we're not going to eat, I've got to pay the mortgage, I have kids, all that stuff. But as the years have gone by, you've heard a couple of times that things are complicated. Well, when we first started talking about rape, we were talking about stranger rape because that's what could get funded. That's who reported. That's what we knew. And then, of course, we went to stranger danger child sexual abuse. The guy with the fedora and the trench coat, that sort of thing. None of which, of course, it's true. Does it happen? Yes, but in this minuscule proportion to who is going to sexually abuse kids. Acquaintance rape, which is the vast majority of what you will see and what we have here. Incest, sexual harassment, special issues with women of color. The Sexual Violence Center was a big part of starting. It was then called the Phyllis Wheatley Sexual Assault Program in the African American community up on the north side. And we did all of their training and got them on their feet. I don't know whether it's still going. I don't think so. And the Indian Women's Resource Center, which is still going, they had some sexual assault advocates and that sort of thing, and we helped train them. It was thought at the time that everyone needed their own, and sometimes that's true and sometimes it's not, but those programs did a whole lot of work in their communities for years and years. Ritualistic abuse. We had for a while, the Sexual Violence Center was the phone line for any ritual abuse issues in Minnesota. So, and it was not as big an issue as people thought, but it was an issue, and so we were trained by the FBI. It was really weird having an FBI guy come to my house on a Saturday afternoon to train us about ritual abuse and what we could do and what we couldn't do and that sort of thing. And then in 1985, there was, also due to Peggy Spector, there was a state group that was studying sexual exploitation by counselors and therapists. And this was also brought about by Walk-In Counseling, who is also still a fabulous referral, who had been seeing victims of abuse by therapists for years and years. And I was on the public education task force for 4 years, I guess, and out of that came the addition in the Criminal Sexual Conduct Code, which you will see, about it being illegal for therapists and counselors to have sex with their clients. Again, that power differential. You can't consent. One of the work groups in the Sexual Exploitation by Counselors and Therapists Task Force was a clergy task force. Small, but, and this is so before all the headlines and the lawsuits and all of those things. But Minnesota was the first in the world to have a conference on sexual exploitation by clergy. People came from all over the country, and the keynote speaker, her name was Mary Pellauer, and she had I don't know how many PhDs, and she taught at every college, and all this stuff, and she was an SVC volunteer. She took, how do I say it? She took our language, added theology to it, and people said it was the most brilliant keynote they'd ever seen. And I'm in the back of the room laughing and laughing and laughing, because all she did was take Rape 101. But it was, and out of that came a task force through the Minnesota Council of Churches that sort of blew the lid open on the sexual exploitation by clergy stuff. And at one point, we were getting about 10 clients a week on the crisis line. And it was insane. And now today, what I was doing and why I'm not in jeans is that I was batting cleanup after a deposition for a client who is suing a clergy abuse client. So I still do that in my off hours and that sort of thing. But so it's still going on. You're still seeing issues. I think the Duluth diocese just settled for X number of $1 million and all this stuff. The task force was never about the Catholics. We've had victims from the Lutherans and Methodists, Buddhists. I worked with a lot of Buddhist sanghas, Native American prayer circles. So it's not just about Catholics and little boys. It's about adults and all denominations. And even with Catholics, it's a small percentage of the clergy, but it's still going on. That was another one where I thought, well, if people just understand it, and they learn about it in seminary, and they learn about power and control, and they get it, it won't happen anymore. Now, certainly some of my cases are 30 years old. We're still cleaning up, or I guess I'm still going to Canada once in a while to do to work with some of the victims of the Native American boarding schools there. And that hit headlines years and years ago, and it's pretty much over in terms of lawsuits and that sort of thing now. But we're still working on it, and we're still, doing the stuff. Male victimization. There was a therapist at the Rape and Sexual Assault Center, and I was at the Sexual Violence Center, and they used to put us together on TV so we would fight, because he worked with male victims. And they got so upset when we wouldn't fight. First of all, we liked each other, and I was never saying that there are no male victims, or that male victims don't need to be treated and need to be supported and advocated for. And he wasn't saying the same thing, so they stopped getting us together, but it worked for a while. Transgender victims. For a while, the Sexual Violence Center was host to a significant number of transgender victims. And, it's still, the sexual assault is still happening, and it's still going on, and hopefully not as many as there used to be. Some of the stuff that was on the board: pornography, the flesh industry, chemical dependency and sexual assault. All of these things, became a chemical dependency counselor, not because I wanted to work in a treatment center, but because so many of the victims that I worked with were chemically dependent. And if they went into treatment and said, I was raped or I was an incest victim, at that time, people would say, we don't deal with that here. So you've got someone trying to go through 12 steps or trying to get help, but one of the issues, you're just right there. I'm so sorry. Okay, you. So while I was in school for chemical dependency counselor training at the U, I realized that all of, when you're in a graduate program like that, you're in with the same people, class after class after class after class, so you get to know them all. And so I made them promise that once they got settled at Hazelden or St. Mary's or any of the programs, that they would find out what is the what do you say on intake? Do you ask the question? Have you ever been sexually assaulted or battered or anything? And of course, to a program, it was no. They didn't ask because they didn't want to know. And so with all of my friends, we began to say, but it makes sense to ask. It makes sense to know that. It makes sense to work with it. And eventually, now most of them do. Now most of them ask. And while they may say that isn't the primary issue here, at least they will take it as a stressor or a therapeutic issue or whatever they need to do to help people while they're in treatment. And the same goes with eating disorders. We used to do a lot of training, and I don't know if it's done anymore, but do a lot of training in the eating disorder programs about sexual violence because there are so many linkages. And you'll learn more than you've ever wanted to know in the next few weeks. What you hear, you cannot unhear. What you learn, you cannot unlearn. I knew I was in trouble when my daughter called from college, and she was in Bozeman, Montana, and she said, "Guess what I just did?" And I thought, oh, I don't want to know. She said, "I just finished training at the Rape Crisis Center here in Bozeman." And I went, "Oh no, don't do it, run away." And she's a teacher now. She did not, follow in my footsteps or anything like that. But she knows a lot, and she teaches middle school. So she knows how to intervene, and she lives here in Minneapolis now. By just showing up tonight, you have begun your process of advocacy for a better world. Questions?
You've been in this field for...
Ever. By the way, I was 10 when I started. No.
So, I'm curious in terms of some of the major changes that you've seen, but still things that are still the same.
Yes. Well, no, they're not the same. They're better, and still bad things happen. I thought, okay, so I'm the eternal optimist. Like when I left Duluth to come down to Minneapolis, I was not coming to a job in the sexual assault field. And I literally, you have to understand, there were 5 advocates in St. Louis County. St. Louis County is the biggest county in the state. It goes all the way to the Canadian border, practically, and there were no other programs in the northern part of the state. So we had all of the lake area, the Arrowhead area. We had everything from Hinckley on up. And so we'd go out driving in the middle of the night to the hospitals. And there were no SARS nurses. You'll hear about those, the resource center. There was nothing like that. There weren't rape kits. I had to teach the officers when I was at the hospital. I would have to teach the officers that shaking out the woman's clothes on the floor is probably not a good idea. Or we had to say, we also covered Superior, Wisconsin, because it's the sister city of Duluth, and so I'd go over the bridge, and one night I met the victim at the hospital, and we were in an examining room, and all of a sudden 3 cops walk in. And they were under the mistaken belief that they had to protect the chain of command of the chain of evidence. And so they were going to have to watch this whole thing going on. And I got them out, and then about 8 nurses and doctors were just wandering through. And I finally went out and said, "What?" And they just wanted to see what a real rape victim looked like. And they said it out loud. So it's like, okay, go away. That's how much we've taught people. I worked with, to be honest, well, we trained police officers in Duluth and sheriff's offices and that sort of thing. I have worked with some of the most amazing cops over the years that would have done anything to keep this woman feeling safe. Not staying. You'll hear that, cops should not stand over a victim who's sitting down with, if he's 6 feet and his gun is right there, and his crotch is right there. And they couldn't figure out why that made people uncomfortable. I mean, those are little things, but we taught the whole response thing to police officers and all of that. And then I see the Star Tribune articles and I go, whoa. That doesn't mean that they were always being done right, but it means that instead of sort of continuing the path of progress, somehow it slipped up in places. And I'm so glad it all went public. And, people deserve a lot of credit for having that go public. And I think things will change. I think it shamed the systems, but it also put police officers on notice. So I think that's good. So things have changed. I mean, we can sit here and talk about stuff that we couldn't, that literally, in 1974, I would be on the news a lot in Duluth, and I would be sure to get threatening phone calls. And this is, by the way, landlines. This was in the days of landlines, no internet, nothing like that, which is probably a good thing at that point. But, you know, the guy who calls me who says, you've got 2 really big oak trees in your front yard, and I've been standing behind it. And one of these days, while you're walking, because I lived 5 blocks from the university where I taught at that point, you know, one of these days I'm going to get you. And oh, by the way, sometimes you've got a stroller. Well, I had a small child. So he'd been waiting, and nothing ever happened that I know of. Not to me. But we would get obscene phone calls by the dozens. And I happened to have a name that there were only 3 in Duluth. And they were all relatives, so we didn't want, you know. So we can say more, we can do more, the laws are better, the systems are better. We just have to sort of keep plodding away.
However, you know, when the information came out about the backlog of rape kits.
Oh, that's insanity.
Staggering.
That is just, it is insanity.
Oh.
And of course, I'm not in the field anymore. I had no idea. And I'm thinking of the number of people that I walked through rape kits, you know, and I got one woman wrote a 1-act play. They hadn't done her rape kit right, and she was at the police department, and they told her that she had to go into a closet and pluck out pubic hair because they needed hair samples. And so there she was in a dark closet, and I didn't know her at the time, picking pubic hair. I mean, literally pulling pubic hair so they could get samples. And she wrote this 1-act play that was so funny. You know, it was great. That's how I met her, was the 1-act play. So, you know, lots of things have changed, I hope. Other questions, anything?
I
Yeah.
just wonder, I mean, it's obviously a hugely systemic
Mm-hmm.
issue, but what kind of work is done? I don't even quite know how to describe it, but it's just like the perpetrators or the possibility of understanding what a perpetrator is. Is that work done?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I mean, so that people can I just really feel as though there are so many times when I think that there are people who don't realize they're raping somebody.
Oh, absolutely.
A lot.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And going by a you know, pervasive feeling of if she's been drinking or if she did this or if she did that,
Right.
then it can't be rape. Well, if women believe that, and women do, why wouldn't men?
But are men worked with on that?
Well, yes and no. Well, certainly, first of all, you've got the men who get caught and
Yeah,
who
but
get
I wanna
sentenced.
think about it before they're
Well,
made,
true, but it's really, but all of those men will get out of jail. No man has ever been sentenced to life in prison for a rape or incest or whatever. Doesn't happen. Murder, yes. Well, not even murder very much. So, when we were in 1974, when we started the class on rape, I went down to St. Peter. It was then St. Peter State Hospital. Now it's St. Peter Regional Treatment Center. And that's where the mentally ill and dangerous sex offenders were. And so I spent time with them and working with them. And I happened to know the head of the program. So I was in with a lot of them. And they were pretty diagnosable. You know, there was a lot of things wrong with them and the rapes. You know, so they would be in there for a long time, and you hear sometimes about letting people go out of St. Peter and how difficult that is and how they want to put them somewhere safe, but they can't. Then I spent time years later at, oh, for heaven's sakes, what's next to Little Canada? Lino Lakes. And that was, I'm going to forget, it had an acronym. But those were sex offenders who were going to be released. And I actually would bring some of the volunteers from the Sexual Violence Center up to Lino Lakes. And they would sort of share, not that the volunteers were victims, but they would share stories and this sort of thing, and the guys would talk, and what would sometimes happen, and it would disturb me, is that we would always leave and meet somewhere. I wouldn't let the women go home until we had met and debriefed. And you would hear these women say, who are my volunteers, been through same training you have, and would say, those poor guys. They had, horrible lives and wives that didn't love them and blah, blah, blah. And you realize just how manipulative it can be, and how then I would have to say yes and look at the choices. There is a myth that sex offenders were abused as children. The studies that we have are only on the men who are caught, which is a small percentage, caught and sentenced. So that's a small percentage of the people, because you have 95% of, let's say, male victims who would no more hurt their kids than they would fly. I've had many, many male victims who I worked with over the years who were afraid to have children because they were afraid that they would do to their children what their father did to them. And the fact that there was that fear there meant that they'd done a whole lot of work, But how awful that would be, But those are the people who don't become offenders, but who are often painted by, well, if you were a victim, you're going to turn into an offender, and it's simply not true. The studies were skewed because you're studying prisoners in prisons, and yes, many of them were abused in lots of ways as kids, but that doesn't mean there is an absolute victim to offender route. There simply isn't. Okay, last question, anything? Thanks, it was fun.